and welcome to another evening of frank conversation here on Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. I'm Maokpe Ogun Yusuf. Tonight, in a two-part interview, we speak with the Minister of Works and Housing, Babatunde Fashola, a senior advocate of Nigeria, on a number of issues, including the recent collapse of a building in Ikoyi and its implication for Nigeria's national housing market, infrastructure development, especially with regards to funding for roads, and politics, in the light of development on the Electoral Act and the future of his party without President Buhari on the ballot. Honorable Minister, welcome to Hard Copy.
Thank you for having me here again.
Well, hardly do we ever start with the Ministry of Housing when we speak with you on this program, and I've noticed that in many other programs, so unless it was specifically on housing, hardly did we ever start with housing. But the recent tragedy in Ikoyi on the 1st of November, it seems to be forcing our hands otherwise. As a former governor of Lagos State, where the tragedy occurred, and one who had to also combat the menace of collapsed buildings, and now one who heads the Ministry of Housing, what wider implications do you think that collapse had for the housing sector?
Well, it's really first a matter of pain and regret that in the process of supposedly developing shelter and providing opportunities for growth, a tragedy that leads to the loss of many lives like this has to occur, and one is really saddened by this, and I wish that this would be the last. But for this to be the last, there are certain things that certainly must happen, and most of those things, I must say, lie first with how people employed at the subnational level with responsibility for granting permits and all of those type of things, and also monitoring compliance, how they do their work. Because urban planning and housing development control, they are clearly subnational responsibilities. That said, I think that there are also, for me, positives, acts of heroism and survival from that tragedy, and I think that they bear mention and reporting. As a lot of people were running away from that scene, there were men and women who were running into that scene, trying to save lives, trying to recover the injured, and we must salute their effort. It is really gallant work.
Why you say that there are lessons to be learned from it, and you're hoping that this will be the last one, and you've said that largely, regulation must lie with the subnationals, and that's where it lies. Some people have spoken of a national housing code. They believe that there ought to be a national guideline from which, the subnationals can draw, and they've spoken to that. Do we have a national housing code, and what effect of law, what force of law does it have?
Specifically to answer your question, yes, we have a national building code. And that code was revised and updated, I think, in 2018 or 2019. I had the privilege as minister then to do it, present it to the Federal Executive Council for approval, which was approved. And then, if you go back into your file, you will see briefings that I made after the Federal Executive Council on the day that it was approved. But we didn't stop there. We then shared the contents of the code at the National Council for Housing and Lands. That is a National Council meeting that we hold with all state commissioners responsible for housing and land matters, where we share national policy. Just as I have this year shared the national tolling policy with all states at the National Council of Works, But that is one side of the story. And even though I am not an engineer, I know that the practice and the study of engineering, there are things that have become global and standard. And whether you study engineering in Nigeria, whether you study it in the North Pole, there are some basic minimum things that have become like global standards that nobody can invent his own type. And therefore, with or without the existence of a national building code, there are some things that are just the product of science and arithmetic that decides whether a building stays up or stays down. And they teach you that as foundational work. I'm sure anybody in the built industry will tell you this.
Well, I think the complaint from those who say that, you know, we do not have one is that the building code doesn't have the force of law, does it?
Well, again, if there is need to legislate on the details of a building code, that may be work for those who feel so strongly about it to how do you say, to challenge our legislators to enact the law. But these things have become...
You don't see a need for it?
These things have become so quite global in their application. How you mix concrete, how you design the substructure, what kind of reinforcement you use, how you build in certain terrain, if it's swampy, if it's marshy, if it's rocky. These things have become so global, and I think people should stop looking for another layer of legislation. They have become trade practice, if you like, that you know that if you do them, the results that you expect are predictable, and if you deviate from them, the consequences can be similar to what we are now having to talk about.
I think the concern for a number of people is now that these consequences happen by not following, because we're yet to see what the investigation, the outcome of the investigation that will be carried out by the Lagos State panel will give out. But obviously something went wrong, and they believe that, you know, people should be held to account, and they think that perhaps if there is a building code with a force of law,
for accounting.
Yes.
You see, and again, without trying to preempt what the state government has done, this is a classic case for a coroner's inquest. And once you have a coroner's inquest, there is enough laws to ensure that you punish people. There is possibly a crime element if the coroner finds one. There is probably a dereliction of duty if the coroner finds one. And all of those things resulting in loss of lives and damage to property have consequences under our criminal law enacted. So it's not about looking for more laws, really and truly. The professional associations, and this speaks to professionalism really, and the need to weed out those who are not authorized to do certain things from attempting to do them or actually doing them without consequences. There are also professional regulations about minimum standards of conduct and behavior in that trade, and there are actions that will be deemed to have brought the profession into disrepute. And so there must be a self-examination too amongst all the possibly identifiable people and the profession and the trade groups that they represent in the built industry to say, no, we will not accept this standard.
I don't know if you see any other implications internationally for our housing sector. This is the building which came crashing down was in a luxury market, obviously also to attract international investors, and them looking at the local markets and wondering what is going on in Nigeria. As Minister of Housing, do you think is of concern to you?
I am always looking for the positive and bright side of things, really. So my sense would be that the outcome of the investigations, how we manage this, for example, will send the most compelling message about our seriousness to any investor looking in from outside, that this was an exception, not a rule.
Indeed. Now let's talk about the housing sector in general. Now, just a few days ago, the federal government announced a housing bond to raise capital to finance and develop housing infrastructure in Nigeria. I think about 300 to 500 billion naira is how much has been looked at to raise in bonds. Would there be specifics as to the type of developers who will be able to access this funding when it is eventually raised?
Okay, so I need to quickly say this before we get ahead of ourselves. In the course of my intervention in this industry from many years back to now, there are certain things I've also learned. And one of the things I see is that as a federal government, although we have a Ministry of Housing, the real deal lies in the states. That's where the land is controlled by the states. That's where the residents are controlled by the states. And without the land, how many houses could federal government possibly build? And some of the recommendations and discussions I've had at the Federal Executive Council and at our last retreat was that, look, listen, we need to review what we're doing. Yes, we have the Federal Mortgage Bank, but is there another way by which we can inject more capital into the market so that slowly but surely we become what we should be really, a policy ministry for the country, while the real bolts and nuts gets done at the state level. So, and I think that has caught the fancy and the attention of some people, and they think that this can be useful, because I suggested that as a federal government we should be looking at how to invigorate our fiscal and monetary policies such that there can be longer term funding for financing for housing, because houses are not things that are built and perishable, so they last for decades. Can we find the kind of funding that matches them in terms of construction and life cycle? And also, houses are not things you should buy off the shelf, like a pair of sunglasses and so on and so. Can we also find longer term finances to support those who want to take mortgages? People have chosen to call it a bond. As I said in my speech, it may be a bond, it may be more than a bond, it may be a sukuk, it may be a tax credit scheme, it may be anything, but it is for all of those who are likely to be impacted. And that's why we invited Ministry of Finance, invited Debt Management Office, we invited the builders, and we set up a working team to also talk to the people who are likely to be off-takers. What can we do more to improve the situation? There are things that exist that are not yet being optimized. There's a long conversation going on, and DMO was with us saying that too, some of these things already exist, and if they're not hitting target, perhaps this working committee can come back with recommendations that help us to address them and make sure that we hit the target. What
I'm trying to clarify from you now is whether there was no approval of a housing bond then. Are you saying that conversation is still ongoing on this subject?
As far as I'm aware, there is no housing bond. The only thing I'm aware of, I think, is that the Family Homes Fund under the Minister of Finance is trying to raise something with sukuk. That's what I'm aware of.
Okay, so I mean, the news was that the federal government had announced approval of a housing bond to raise capital for developers. That was the story.
I'm not aware of that, unless, of course, Federal Mortgage Bank was raising. I think they had a fundraiser through the DMI, which was backed up by the DMO, but not at Federal Executive Council level.
I'm wondering, what is the relationship of the Ministry of Housing with the Federal Mortgage Bank? Talking about in terms of, achieving the larger policies of housing for your ministry.
Okay, I see what you mean. Now, as minister, my understanding is that the Federal Mortgage Bank is a parastatal created by statute. It has a CEO, has a management, it has a board. Now, the broad policy of government is affordable housing. That's the broad policy of government. Everything that Federal Mortgage Bank then does under its statutory powers must be in aid of achieving that policy. My responsibility to pull them back is when they go against the policy.
Honorable Minister, can I ask you,
Yes.
what is affordable housing? I know that you've kicked against the term low-cost housing, but according to the policy of the federal government, what will affordable housing mean?
Affordable housing will mean housing that is accessible to people either to rent or to buy based on their incomes and based on how they are made to pay for it. Because just recently, housing that you have to pay for cash and carry one day will never be affordable. Rent that you have to pay 2 years rent in advance from a salary that is payable monthly in arrears will never be affordable. So it's not just the cost of building and the type of building, but also how people are made to pay for it. And I make that point very, very seriously.
But going by the definition of, affordable housing, how would you say that the federal government and by extension your ministry is succeeding in giving Nigerians affordable housing?
Well, if you look at the number of mortgages that have been issued by the Federal Mortgage Bank, and I've provided some data of this in the past, the number of home refurbishment loans that have been given, if you look at the number of houses that we have delivered directly, if you look at the number of houses that Federal Housing Authority themselves have delivered, and if you look at what the states are also doing, we are making progress. We are making progress, without a doubt. And it will be wrong, I contend, to expect that the housing problems of any nation, indeed, will be solved or are solvable only by our governments.
So I was trying to make the distinction between the luxury market, which is where it would seem that the private developers are more concerned, they are in it for profit, as opposed to affordable housing, which is where you are really, really concerned.
Affordable housing must deliver returns too, otherwise it's not sustainable. And I think that we should have this conversation to enlighten the Nigerian people. There's nothing like free housing.
I don't think a lot of people are looking for free housing. But sorry, Honorable Minister, sorry to interrupt you. If you are saying that, it must be something that people can afford through rent or through ownership, and that, if you're going to be paying rent, if you're paying rent on 2 years advance on a salary that is monthly, it is not affordable. And if you look at the spectrum, I don't know if you've ever done a poll on it, and look at how many Nigerians have to pay a year's rent in advance, and they are still on a monthly salary, the chances are high that you might get a pretty high percentage as opposed to those who are, allowed to pay, say, maybe monthly or maybe even on a yearly basis. If you were to look at that population or that demographic, the chances are high that a lot of people will say that perhaps the federal government hasn't done as well as it'd like to think it has.
Perhaps before you put the federal government on the spot in terms of housing, perhaps it is important to remind yourself and to remind our viewers that land, the very, very big component in the construction and delivery of housing, is not a federal government matter. It's a state matter, and it is important to remember that.
Well,
so if you are making omelets and you don't make the eggs, then you must understand that your ability and the quantity of omelets you will deliver are dependent on the number of eggs that you can get. So let's just get that straight. And let us also understand.
Are you, sorry, Honorable Minister, are you insinuating that the states are not cooperating with you
I am
on
not
this?
insinuating that the states are not cooperating. I am saying that the responsibility, the bigger responsibility of delivering houses, as it is done in other federations, lie with the subnationals. The American federal government doesn't build houses.
Nonetheless, we still
No, please. So that let's compare things that make sense with things that make sense. But I know that the federal government has a role to play in ensuring that more houses are available. And
in line with its policy.
And it is in this sense, that I make the point that our fiscal and monetary policy measures will be very impactful in helping the states and, more importantly, the private sector operators who are stepping in to build houses.
Let me just quickly confirm this. The Ministry of Housing builds houses as we speak currently.
Yes, we do. We have a pilot program. The reason for that pilot program is very simple, as I've maintained. The national housing policy during the Second Republic had some problems of acceptability. There are some houses that were built that were never lived in. And we decided that in order to frame a policy for the country about types of houses, it was important to get a base data about what type of houses people will live in. So we did a survey, and we found out that people will live in more bungalows in the northern part of the country, and the climate and the land use was more acceptable to it, and perhaps more blocks of flats in the southern part of the country. Having collected that data, we then decided to sample by proving our results in construction. That's what we're doing.
Okay. Anyways, you have sampled now, you have built, and
so that's what we're doing. And we're going to start selling in a matter of days.
In a matter of days?
Yes.
It is interesting, like you say, matter of days. Because the National Assembly seem concerned that a few of the houses which you have built have remained unoccupied.
Yeah, their concerns are justified. They moved the houses have been built. That's progress.
They moved a motion just on Tuesday this week that you should earnestly begin the process of disposing completed houses to deserving Nigerians. Why has it taken so long?
If that is a problem, it's a good problem to have. At least we have built.
Indeed. The question now is, how do you intend to dispose?
Now, the conventional way was print forms and then tell people to come and buy forms. And we have had some experiences we don't want to even go back to with that. I also have experience from my work at the subnational level where we sold the houses on an online platform, open, transparent, competitive, nothing to hide. And it's a similar platform we are replicating at the national level. It's taking a little more time than before, but as minister, I don't want to be bogged down with petitions. I get petitions every day. They've taken my land here, they've taken my property here. I don't want to be bogged down with all those things. So we want to open the system, get online. If you can pay, pay. We've opened a payment platform there, how you pay, the cards that are acceptable, the payment system that are acceptable.
It's not going to be a one-off payment, is it?
No. It's not going to be a one-off payment. It's first you pay for your application online, and then you get a mortgage or whatever payment plan you have, then you sort that out with the system administrator who will be administrating. But the important thing is that if we can book an airline seat from our handheld devices, I don't see why we can't book and pay for a plot of land or a bungalow in the same process, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, I don't know how open it's going to be, but I'm sure that government workers will be thinking that they might get priority, will they?
Government workers who are entitled, who feel interested in the program should apply like others. After all, we're all Nigerian citizens. I don't see why those who have the privilege of serving must take more than those they serve. That's my sense of it. It's public service. And we must hold ourselves to about the same standards that members of the public who we are supposed to serve are expected to hold themselves. So in a competitive and free environment, let everybody apply. And the system will tell you who booked first, who booked next, and who booked last, and who paid first and who paid last.
It's the end of the first part of this interview. Next week, we bring you the Minister's responses to questions around funding for road projects, the Electoral Act Amendment Bill as passed by the National Assembly, and who he'll be supporting for president come 2023. In the meantime, let us know your thoughts on the housing sector using the handles on your screen. Thank you for watching. I'm Maokwe Ogun Yusuf. Good night.